All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Scott. With us now is Scott Horton. He's a libertarian anti-war activist and also a journalist, and he's been published at on a number of different outlets. I'm so glad that he's with us now, and is another example of the diversity of thought that we have on this vigil, and the strength of the unity of that support for Julian Assange. Thank you so much, Scott, for being with us today.
Very happy to be here. Thanks.
So what brought you, I know that your background is definitely anti-war, but what brought you specifically to support WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, and when did that happen?
Well, I was interested in the story of WikiLeaks from as soon as it existed. I can't say I delved too deep into it, but there were leaks about corruption, intervention in Somalia and a couple other places, and I knew some journalists. In fact, when I think back on it, I think we knew about the upcoming leak before others, and Assange was exploring different ways of getting them out there, and it ended up being the Manning leak, what we now know to be the Manning leak back then. So that was just the greatest thing that ever happened at that point in terms of, as God's greatest gift to journalism. I think people, especially, we're having this conversation in 2018. It's been a long time ago. Maybe a lot of people were too young then to really know the story or whatever. But if you Google cables reveal, you'll find 20,000 news stories from all over the world of the almost just unlimited level of either outright, brand new stories and brand new journalism that came out of the State Department cables from the Manning leak, or at least one good solid paragraph of a news story about a topic where they say, and State Department cables confirm this, and State Department cables add to the story this, that, and the other thing. There's an unlimited number of stories that have been published, and by the same journalists and journalistic organizations that routinely condemn WikiLeaks and Assange, and for that matter, didn't do anything to stick up for then Bradley, now Chelsea Manning at the time either. I'm more than happy to, exploit those cables for what they're worth. And seriously, there's a ton of important stuff in them, and we could talk all about that if you want. But at the time, it was late 2010, early 2011. And so it was 550,000 something State Department cables, as well as what were called the Iraq and Afghan war logs, which were secret level, just like the State Department cables, secret level, not top secret, that have, sources and methods and CIA spies, real names, and this kind of thing, but just secret level communications, confidential level and secret level, at the State Department cables. And then also the war logs were basically military, Army and Marine Corps reports, I think primarily of, infantry out in the field reporting back to base of what was going on that day, that kind of thing. And these are just absolute gold mines for journalism, and so much important stuff came out about that. So that was, and I work for antiwar.com, and that was my radio show. I think I interviewed Assange right around the time of these leaks coming out. I think maybe I interviewed him before this and then after as well. And another part of the story is how the WikiLeaks, the State Department cables, helped to kickstart the Arab Spring protests, because the revolution in Tunisia really took place, I guess, in late January or early February 2011. But what had happened was, for about 6 weeks leading up to that, had been a major debate in the country. Everybody knew what a scumbag Ben Ali, the American-backed sock puppet dictator there, was. But the State Department cables had all these details about the corruption of the dictator's wife's family and all of the money they'd stolen and all their gold bricks and all their just, comic book level thievery. And it was such a huge scandal. And so when the riots touched off, it was basically a bread riot that got out of control. And at that point, because of the WikiLeaks scandal in the background and the Ben Ali corruption scandal in the background, there was only one conclusion from the riots, and that was the dictator had to go. And then, of course, as soon as that happened, the Egyptians said, wow, you can do that? And they all went outside and overthrew their American-backed dictator. And then, of course, America and Saudi and our allies hijacked the Arab Spring, particularly in Libya and Syria, and that was all she wrote about that. Crushed it in Bahrain and Yemen. But anyway.
I think that's incredibly important.
Right out of that.
It's incredibly important that we remember, because so much, especially recently, the focus has narrowed in on the effect of WikiLeaks publications on United States politics. But I think it's really important that you make that distinction, that WikiLeaks publications have had such massive influence around the world in many different countries, not just the United States.
Yeah.
So thank you for re-emphasizing that.
Right. Yeah. And, I mean, honestly, the State Department cables to this day are full of stories that are still yet to be reported. The same for the Iraq and the Afghan war logs. And and people should see this if they've never seen it. It's so easy to find on YouTube. There's the shorter version and the longer version of what's called the collateral murder video. And this is part of what motivated then Chelsea Manning, to leak these documents was he knew that this massacre had happened. He'd seen the video. And not only that, knew that a Washington Post reporter named David Finkel had seen the video, and he had reported on what was in it. Or let's see, I forgot exactly the story here, but he had referred to it, but without really revealing the video to the Washington Post audience or telling all what was in it. And so Manning felt compelled to reveal this. And it was interesting because, well, one of the things that was interesting about it was that Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense, said, yeah, well, here's a bunch of civilians, Reuters reporters being slaughtered by an Apache helicopter and everything. Yeah, sure. But this is looking at war through a soda straw. And so you're only seeing this glimpse, but you don't understand the context. But of course, what was funny is if you had zoomed out on the context of what was going on there, these guys actually fighting, the guys that David Finkel covered in his book, The Good Soldiers here, and wrote about for the Washington Post, they were fighting against Muqtada al-Sadr in eastern Baghdad, when, of course, the entire Iraq War II was fought on behalf of the United Iraqi Alliance coalition of Shiite leaders, which included Sadr. And he's the guy who just came out in first place in the elections a few months ago. And so this wasn't fighting against the Sunni-based insurgency. This was fighting against the Shia we were fighting for, just the least favored of the Shia we were fighting for. So talk about war through a soda straw. Go out there and get those bad guys. Go get those militants. Go find, someone with a telephoto lens that looks like it might be a shoulder-fired something and blast them. That's war through a soda straw. And if you zoomed out, you could see that their mission was complete nonsense, even in the context of the rest of the war, which was nonsense itself, which was being fought for no good end itself. And so here's this incredible massacre of these people, and then including a massacre of the family, the father with two young kids with him, who pulls up in a minivan to try to rescue the wounded, and then they blast him too. And it's just, and this is one of the things that pushed Manning into that leak. Another part of the story that people don't really know that much about Manning and that leak, and this is revealed in the chat logs, and I think was confirmed at the trial, at the court-martial as well, was that Manning was made to participate in basically the booking of men who were arrested by Iraqi security forces. And this included people who were completely innocent of any crime. And the one that he talked about in his chat logs with the guy that eventually turned him in to the feds was a guy who had written an article that was critical of Nouri al-Maliki, who is now, even the Republicans admit he's the worst guy, shouldn't have picked him, et cetera, right? At the time, this is Bush's handpicked guy, and Obama, was backing him as well I guess this would have been 2009 or 10 when Manning is doing this deciding. And this man wrote an essay for the newspaper, and it was called, "Where Did the Money Go?" So which is exactly the kind of thing that you might write for your local newspaper, right? And it was about the corruption of the local politicians. And they had this man arrested, and he was being taken off to be tortured. And Manning
Incredible.
was being put in the position of being forced to participate in this. And so said to his commanding officer, hey, did you realize that this guy's actually under arrest and is off to be tortured over writing a newspaper article? And one that is, you know, you couldn't call it slander. This is perfectly acceptable in any paper in America. And his commanding officer said, get back to work, Manning, and do the job. And that was the point when Manning decided that, he, she, whichever, was going to take these documents and put them in the public domain. So people always said, oh, Manning had these gender confusion issues, and Manning had depression, and Manning was under all this pressure, and Manning didn't belong there, and Manning made this had like a personal nervous breakdown, and so made this decision. But that just is a deliberate ignoring of the reality of the context, as Manning explained, for exactly what the motive was, that he'd seen so many abuses and such corruption and torture in those logs. And as he put it in there, he said, and this was a private conversation. This wasn't, preening for some court or anything like that. This was a private conversation in the chat logs that, better. The rat, Adrian Lamo, was trying to set Manning up and was trying to lure Manning into treason and was saying, well, why don't you sell these documents to the Chinese or the Russians or something? And Manning says, no, that has nothing to do with what this is about. I want the American people and the people of the world, the civilian, right, is what he meant, the people of the world, to see what the truth is, and so that we can use democracy to make reforms, right? This very, perhaps naive, but ultimately perfectly Jeffersonian view of information, free information and journalism in the marketplace, that this is what's supposed to happen. The American people are supposed to see that, wait, our mission in Iraq, I thought we were helping these people and creating a democracy, and you're telling us that we're still torturing them and we're handing them over to other people to be tortured, and that this is still going on years after we were told it had come to an end, and all this kind of thing. And a lot more stories than that, all kinds of massacres and horrors and war crimes out of there. And it worked too. In a specific, overall in affecting American opinion on the wars, but it also worked on the specific question of staying in Iraq. Because one State Department cable revealed, it was actually not one of the military war logs, it was a State Department cable describing how some soldiers had massacred this family and, executed them at point blank range, including a baby. And then they had, in 2006, and had called in an airstrike to try to cover up the massacre, but the airstrike took out the wrong part of the house. And so the bodies all survived, and it became a problem, and the locals came and picked up the bodies and took them to the morgue. And so they clamped it down, and it was a big cover-up. But then this story came out that what the Iraqis had known all along, and that the Americans had lied and lied and lied about, really was true after all. And this created a huge controversy right at the time that Barack Obama in late 2011 was trying to renegotiate the status of forces agreement to allow the United States to stay in the country, which would have required the Iraqis granting immunity to American soldiers accused of war crimes. And so Maliki, once this story came out, it created such a backlash, and I guess it was a Shiite family too, and so they're the ones in control of the parliament. And so this created such a political backlash that there was no way that they could do it, and they stuck to the Bush agreement and the timeline to kick American forces out in 2011, which ultimately was short-lived, but that was because of the Obama's support for the war in Syria. So anyway, which that's another story in the WikiLeaks.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's so much. They've published millions of documents. So the number of stories that have been reported and are yet to be reported from what the information they've published are just, mind-boggling. But I think it's really, important to recognize, as you said, as you bring up the fact that the closer you look at these details and the facts surrounding these cases, what a heroine Chelsea Manning turns out to be in so many ways. And when you look at the chat logs between her and Adrian Lamo, the way in which she was lied to about, Lamo said, I'm a journalist and a priest, or a minister, I believe. And just the deception there was unbelievable. So yeah, I think that For those who were not aware of that history, or who haven't, kind of were too young maybe to remember that, I think it's really, really important that, that history is brought up. And I wanted to ask you about, your interview with Julian Assange that you mentioned as all of this was unfolding, and what insight that gave you into the reality of, what WikiLeaks does, and also what they were reporting on at that time.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I'd actually have to go back and listen to it. It's been a while, but Assange, I don't think I learned anything in that interview different than what I already thought of him, or what I think of him now, which is that basically he's just a good reporter, my kind of reporter who, the famous quote, right, was, "I enjoy crushing bastards." Well, that's what journalism is for, right? Is going after the people who are at least on the verge of impossible to go after, right? Those are the people who deserve it the most. And so, in fact, that reminds me, I had this in my notes so I wouldn't forget. I wrote it, not that I'm looking at them, but anyway, there's this manifesto. I don't know the exact title of it, but it's this Julian Assange manifesto that perhaps even predates WikiLeaks, but it's sort of like a mission statement for creating WikiLeaks or something along those lines, where he talks about, I think mostly he's speaking in more general terms and saying government, but I think he's really talking about the U.S. empire more than anything else. And he's saying that, well, this amounts to a conspiracy. That's why all the secrecy is, because what they're doing is wrong, right? Just as if we're talking about the mafia or anything else. And so in order for them to succeed at accomplishing their goals, they have to keep what they're doing secret. And so the way then obviously to disrupt that is to reveal their secrets. And when you reveal their secrets, it may not have some, incredible effect overnight, but what happens is it means that they have to clamp down on secrecy even within their own system, which makes the dissemination of information to the fellow conspirators about what we're doing and how and when that much more difficult to carry out. And so, it's a rearguard action in a sense, but it's an attempt. It's one effect, I guess, of good journalism like this is it gums up the works, right? And then so we've seen that in reaction to WikiLeaks, we've seen all these new measures. I'm sorry, I thought I'd think of the catchphrase there. McClatchy had a great series about this, the new insider threat programs. That's what it is, the new insider threat programs, where in all the police and intelligence agencies and everything, there's this whole new attempt, at least, I don't know how successful it's been, to create this culture of everybody rat on each other and everybody look over each other's shoulder and everybody kind of suspect each other of leaking to WikiLeaks at any given moment, which then makes it much harder for them to do their jobs. Thank God. That's what we want. And so, that's a big part of this. One of the big benefits, I think, of this kind of thing, this form of journalism, and that's what I like about him is I can tell that it's not that just that he's a wrecker. He's a wrecker of all the same things that I hate too, right? The wars and the Clintons and whatever you got, right? So.
Definitely. And I think that it's so important because Julian Assange is isolated and can't speak out, can't express his thoughts on any of the events that are happening now. It's so much more important because of that people bring up the things that he's written, whether it's the book referring to Google and the State Department, or whether it's the manifesto that you're referencing. So thank you for bringing that up, because I know that even supporters of WikiLeaks sometimes haven't heard of those documents or unaware of them. So right. I think I appreciate you bringing that up.
The reason that Assange right now is locked up in this embassy is he's got asylum there because I'm almost certain it's the Washington Post has reported that there is a sealed indictment against him for espionage, which is nonsense. And which, there's no, real credible case that you could possibly make that his business is any different in kind than what ProPublica or as a nonprofit, or the New York Times or the Washington Post as for-profit journalistic enterprises do for a living. If the Washington Post has 15 paragraphs and they publish part of a document, is that different than having an introductory paragraph and just posting the whole document? in any real, tangible, definitional type way? No, it's not. It's exactly the same thing. That's it. And, you might argue this is a lot better because this is saying, hey, journalists who may or may not have even known you wanted access to this document, look at what a story I have for you. Here's a document. Go write it. Go confirm it. Go elaborate it. Not everything in the State Department cables is true, right? What's news is that a cable says a thing. It's not necessarily true whatever a cable says, right? One thing was this ridiculous story about North Korea selling missiles that they don't have to Iran, who never bought them, and they had some ridiculous picture of a model mock-up in the New York Times. David Sanger, of course, ran with it in the New York Times. So, people, they're just raw stories. They're not necessarily exactly what you're looking for. But, if Pompeo, our current Secretary of State, who at one time had praised WikiLeaks, says, well, WikiLeaks isn't a journalistic organization. It's a non-state intelligence agency. Well, what does that even mean, right? It's just a made-up word. It doesn't mean anything. If it's an intelligence agency, then that means it hoards all its secrets to use them against people for the benefit of, you'd be talking about a state if it's an intelligence agency. But that's not what he's doing. He's publishing everything online for, everyone to have at it. And that's just not the definition of what an intelligence agency is. All it is basically is just a smear for, it's a newspaper I don't like. It's an online newspaper, and I wish they would stop publishing stuff about me. That's all he's saying there. And to try to criminalize that, obviously they're going to be able to get a grand jury to go along with that. And you know what? Who knows if they could convict him? I guess they could probably convict him. But and maybe they could get the Supreme Court to uphold it. But it's clearly in violation of the spirit and the intent of the First Amendment protection for a free press. This is exactly what it's for. Why do they have so many secrets that they need to keep should be the first question here.
Definitely. And I think that the differentiation that you made earlier just now between the actual truth and the record that WikiLeaks publishes where people are saying various things, that's really important that people understand that WikiLeaks isn't giving you some sort of ultimate narrative of what really happened. What they're giving you is the primary source documents and evidence of what people are saying in their own words. So I know that some people do mistake that. And I think as well, it's really fascinating the way that if you go through and look at the difference between something like the New York Times or the Washington Post and WikiLeaks, as you said, they're not that different as far as the actions that they take of publishing documents. But the difference seems to be that WikiLeaks is this threat because they're not under control in the way that we know legacy press outlets in the US especially are. So I was wondering if you could kind of expand on that for our audience, why it is that WikiLeaks is so, persecuted, but something like the Washington Post or the New York Times that uses WikiLeaks documents is not, and right. the hypocrisy of that.
Well, the first answer why it's like that is because the Washington Post and the New York Times refused to stick up for WikiLeaks. If they said, hell no, this is where we throw down the gauntlet. This is journalism, and we're not going to let you get away with this, and we're going to run pro-Assange propaganda all the time until you fix it, then it would have been fixed by now, right? So the reason it's like this is exactly because they have forsaken WikiLeaks as an organization and, Assange personally, because basically they're cowards, right? They're afraid somebody was going to say that, well, maybe they've crossed the line now too, even though, the Post and the Times, they just put out this movie about the Washington Post where they're patting themselves on the back for the New York Times scoop on the Pentagon Papers. And it's all about how they're willing to risk everything to go ahead and publish anyway, and this kind of thing. But they won't stick up for the right of anyone else to do the same thing. And of course, legendarily, Barton Gellman, who received the the Snowden documents along with Greenwald in them, and published all of these stories based on this classified leak, which is, just like with the Manning leak, this was a whistleblower. This wasn't, an official press release of secret information to David Sanger like you usually get. This is a great scoop, right? Well, the Washington Post editorial board attacked Snowden for treason all day, every day for 9 months or whatever it was, while their own guy, Barton Gellman, forget Greenwald, Gellman is doing story after story after story in the Washington Post as they attack, even the idea that someone would use these documents to do journalism with them. So, I mean, that's the level of hypocrisy, and it goes to show what hawks the editorial boards of both papers are, and the people that control both papers, what hawks they are on this. But at the end of the day, Gelman and formerly Risen and a few of these guys do get some good scoops at these major papers, and they reveal things about government that weren't supposed to be. But overall, no. Overall, they serve the agendas of the powerful, and that's a famous quote from the publisher, or I forget, it was the editor or the publisher of the Washington Post after Iraq War II, which was, he was quoted, I think maybe quoted by Gelman himself, actually saying, well, look, we're going to war. Why are we going to worry about any of this contrary stuff? Their job is serving what the government wants. So most of the time, I don't know, I'm sure Chomsky or his grad students or somebody somewhere have done the ratios, but most of the time when they leak or publish classified information in the Post and the Times, it's because this is what the Pentagon, the CIA, the White House want you to see. And this is what, they want you to think. And then it's much less of the time that they go, ooh, man, somebody gave me a document that undermines the whole story here. Let's look at this. And so what WikiLeaks does is almost entirely the latter, right? What WikiLeaks does is never in service to the empire. It's never about, this will help advance this agenda or that agenda inside the state. It's purely disruptive. And so, even from the point of view of Pompeo, who I mentioned earlier, before condemning Assange and WikiLeaks, he had said, thank goodness for WikiLeaks, because they were doing so much damage to Hillary Clinton with their journalism, right? Not with their intelligence agency apparatus that doesn't really exist except as a matter of rhetoric. They were doing journalism, and journalism was making Hillary look bad, as journalism so often does. And that was helping his guy. That's all. It was as plain as that when he said that. And now the fact that he's the same guy that wants to try to put this spin on it, this pretty transparent spin, I think, it really brings back to the basic question. Well, is WikiLeaks, essentially an online newspaper, isn't it? Or whatever you have to call it to say it's journalism and protected by the First Amendment, then there you go. Now, he's not a U.S. person, so I don't know exactly what the Supreme Court says about the U.S. government trying to consider foreign journalists to be intelligence officers and prosecute them for espionage. As far as I know, that's never been tried. But I really don't know. There certainly have been foreign journalists who were intelligence assets in this country in the past at various times. But I don't know if there's any kind of precedent for attempting to prosecute them like this. I tend to doubt it.
Yeah, one of our earlier panelists discussed that, and the fact that the United States government is not only trying to make an example of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, but trying to set that precedent of legally of prosecuting journalists that are not American and who do not operate in the United States.
Right.
And I think,
look at that. You think about that as a precedent. So that means that anybody reporting for the Telegraph or the Sunday Times in England, or the Independent, that if they publish something that the Americans don't like, we're going to consider them agents of something. And it doesn't even have to be a state. We could just make something up and say, well, this guy's a one-man intelligence outfit. Let's prosecute him for espionage. And obviously, that takes us down a very quick, slippery slope to crazy town. So that couldn't possibly be that they could get away with this, but maybe they could.
I think that it seems like they're definitely trying with everything that they can to set that dangerous precedent, as you point out. Moving forward, how do you think that the public can help support WikiLeaks and Julian Assange? And do you think that given kind of the pivot of Ecuador from, into a positive sort of, not positive is the wrong word, an increased relationship with the United States, what do you think the public should do and can do to show support and solidarity with this cause?
That's a good question. I think my best answer for that would be to pressure the other media outlets, not just the Post and the Times, but pretty much everyone, Like, where are you guys on this Assange issue? How can you, you know, I know that any honest newspaper editor anywhere has got to be able to see themselves in his position and see, you know, how very few shades of gray there are between the two's roles. And it seems like that's really the deal. You know, they say you don't want to pick a fight with the New York Times or any organization that buys their ink by the barrel full. You know, that's what needs to happen here is the media needs to see that the people overall demand, that the market demands that they do the right thing and stick up for free speech for themselves and for everybody else, and including Assange. I mean, really, I'm no lawyer. It's the other Scott Horton's the lawyer. But it just seems crazy to me that they think that they could prosecute this kind of publishing as espionage. Instead, you know, it's like a half measure, a placeholder until they figure out what they're going to do. And in fact, this was the recent story that came out, was that when Assange got the shadow brokers Vault 7 CIA leak, that the CIA wanted that leak stopped more than they wanted Assange's ass. And so they said, all right, let's make a deal. We'll negotiate. You sit on those hacking tools and we'll work out an agreement. This was published in The Hill. And then James Comey intervened when Assange's lawyer apparently made a mistake and brought it up to a senator, a Republican senator, Warren. Or yeah,
I believe that's right. I believe that's correct.
Warner.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And then Warner called Comey, and then Comey scotched it, which must have pissed off the FBI. I mean, the CIA. I'd like to see, you know, what were the results of that at the weekend softball game or whatever, where the CIA guys must have been pissed because Assange then turned around and published those hacking tools and that stuff, you know? So I don't know, but I mean, that's really something. And Assange, as part of the deal was promising that he could prove who really did the DNC leak. And exactly. So this was the negotiation that Comey interrupted. Talk about obstruction of justice up there. These guys, man, I'll tell you, obstruction of something.
It's absolutely incredible, the level of hypocrisy. And as you said, like it seems unbelievable that the United States government could even attempt to prosecute journalism in this way. But it seems to be the reality that is unfolding before us. If in whatever fashion WikiLeaks was unable to operate, or if Julian Assange was unable to lead WikiLeaks, moving forward, how much of a loss would that be for not only independent journalism, but for the entire public, in the sense of their right to know the ways that their governments, plural, are harming them behind the scenes?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, I really don't know, but it sort of seems, you may know much better than me, sort of seems that Assange has set up WikiLeaks to be able to be run without him for just this same kind of event. I don't know if they've been publishing lately, but I know there's an organization beyond him. So hopefully, yes. Even worst case scenario, WikiLeaks will continue on. If they're able to somehow just derail WikiLeaks, I mean, that'll be a pain, but there must be mirrors everywhere in terms of what's already been published. So all that's going to stay. That'll be on the Pirate Bay no matter what, right? And then, you know, hopefully others will, you know, try to fill that void if it comes down to it, you know, and we'll figure out how to make it possible to do the same kind of thing. Of course, there's Cryptome and other things like that out there. Assange, you know, he has a very magnetic, you know, telegenic type personality for media consumption. He makes a great figurehead for WikiLeaks, but ultimately the documents are, you know, that's the substance. That's what really counts. And as long as there's a venue for that to continue to happen, you know, I sure would like to see it. I mean, I know that there are different leaks to different places all the time, but I think we're long overdue for some big shocking stuff.
Absolutely.
Up to a hell of a lot in a lot of places. And there are some big secrets being kept. And you know what? we're at a place too where it's easy enough, I don't know all the details, but these people do. It's easy enough for people to leak to WikiLeaks and get away with it and not have anyone know who they were and how they did it. And, I know that Assange has taken meticulous care to make sure that that's possible to do for those who are sophisticated enough with computers to do the right kind of upload to make it anonymous. And, seriously, our government is killing people with high explosives. And even if, you're Americanist enough, exceptionalist enough that you only care about the Americans, well, Americans are over there getting their legs blown off, their hands blown off, sometimes their lives lost, obviously in reduced numbers compared to before, but still, there are people who are putting their lives on the line big time in these wars, who are willing to risk everything for each other, for what they believe is fighting for freedom and the kinds of things that they're sold. So it seems like it shouldn't really be too much to ask for some comfortable officers sitting at the Pentagon to, upload a thumb drive worth of cold, hard truth that people need to know about how the wars are being run and what's happening over there,
Absolutely.
Like,
yeah. And the reason I bring up the hypothetical of, if WikiLeaks were unable to operate is specifically to emphasize how invaluable they are to the public and to journalists, and that just to kind of point out what the magnitude of that loss if they could not operate. But I agree with you. I think that, although obviously Assange is suffering a great deal right now, I do think that he's set up WikiLeaks in a way where it is not dependent only on him. There are obviously a lot of other people working with WikiLeaks. Yep. What do you, with the constant smear attacks and propaganda narratives against Julian Assange, how do you think the public can help and kind of combat those narratives, even though, we aren't in the position of the Washington Post or the New York Times, and we don't have that establishment kind of platform available to us? How can we still fight back against that type of propaganda?
Yeah. Well, first of all, just keep your eye on the ball. The enemy is the state. And when the state are the ones, designating the people that you're supposed to be hating and fearing, then you should at least always default with skepticism and see, what exactly is their problem. And most of the time you'll find that their claims are false and don't justify whatever it is that they're trying to do. That's why they lie, is because the things they do aren't justified. So they have to try to justify it somehow. So, like we were talking about before, pretending this guy's some kind of intelligence agency instead of just the kind of journalist that makes them angry, which is a different category of human altogether. And so, that's step one, is just stay inoculated, from official narratives, however they're handed down to you from the left or the right, your heroes, your enemies, or whoever they are, and just look at things for what they are. So who's the underdog and who's got all the power? Who's locked up and can't go anywhere and can't communicate at this point, can't even communicate with the outside world, I guess, except through his lawyer, if even that, I don't know. Versus those who are, have all the power in the world and who've made their intent clear that, well, since we can't outright murder him, at least we'd like to lock him in prison for life and this kind of thing. And, people call the guy a traitor. He's from Australia. He's not even an American. How the hell can he be a traitor to America? What allegiance does he owe to us? We ought to be grateful he feels like he owes us the truth. But that's, a burden he's taken on himself, not been assigned to him.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've actually seen people incorrectly identify him as an American. Like, that's the level of ignorance that sometimes surrounds this entire case. It's saddening.
Yeah. Well, and even if he was an American, that would just make him an American hero instead of an Australian one, but whatever.
Absolutely.
And look, I think, my friend Anthony Gregory, back in the days of the Manning leak and, 8 years ago, said, this is just such an obvious dividing line type of issue. If you're bad on Bradley Manning, then you're a bad person. You're so damn lost. Like, screw you. Seriously. You think that this is the bad guy in the story? The person who leaked all of this stuff that we all have a right to know about, the vast crimes brutal war crimes that our government is committing, hither and yon and everywhere, all across, the Middle East, Central Asia, North Africa, Latin America, and unending. And the bad guy is someone who would dare tell the people and betray our beloved Uncle Sam or whatever. If that's the way you look at this, then you're just lost. That's not right. We absolutely have the right to this data. It should have been leaked a long time ago. It should have never been classified in the first place. And if your knee jerks the other way on that, then you're just, well, I guess maybe your party's in power now, whatever. That determines a lot of the reaction, right? But
well, actually, I think it's really interesting that honestly, it's as if, bipartisan support for the truth has happened and does happen more often than we realize. The question isn't, are you a Democrat or Republican, and does that then sway your support for Chelsea Manning? It seems to be more along the lines of, are you pro-establishment or anti-establishment? Right. And I think that's embodied in this vigil as well. But I wanted to ask is, in addition to everything we've already discussed, what are some of the things about WikiLeaks or about Julian Assange that we don't hear about because it's drowned out by the fast-moving news cycle and also the propaganda narratives against WikiLeaks and Julian?
Well, I'm less expert on all the Hillary Clinton stuff. I think I agree. Pretty much everyone seems to agree that the emails made the difference on the margin or were a significant contributing factor to her defeat. So, I just think that's great because, she's the lady who said, well, why can't we just kill this guy? And was probably not kidding. And so, oh, look and then he's the one who leaks that. Right?
Yeah, well, and considering her reaction to Gaddafi, her reaction to killing Gaddafi, I think that we can probably assume that she wasn't joking.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I'm perfectly fine with that. I mean, I think the State Department cables kind of get underplayed because most people just aren't as interested in foreign policy and that kind of thing. But, I think there's some really important truths in there that, especially at the time, had a pretty big effect in terms of the ongoing torture of, mostly Sunni civilians at the hands of the Shiite death squads under American control in Iraq War II. A lot of people saw this movie, American Sniper, the Clint Eastwood movie, where in that movie, the bad guys torture their innocent victims to death with power drills to the skull. But in the actual history of that war, that was America's pets. The Bata Brigade and the Wolf Brigade were the ones who tortured people to death with power drills. Those are the guys that the American GIs were fighting for, not against, in Iraq War II. And that, we already knew that, but that's made very clear in the WikiLeaks cables and the journalism about them. Same for Afghanistan. There are numerous massacres that are covered that, journalists went back to compare what they said in the cables versus, other information that was turned up at the time or that they could go back and find to recreate, the other sides of the story on a great many war crimes there. And, there was a lot of hype about, see, Pakistan, the treacherous Pakistanis stabbing us in the back and backing the Taliban. And that was revealed in those cables, numerous cases of these Taliban fighters clearly being backed by Pakistani forces across the border and that kind of thing. And yet the only narrative we got out of it was what treacherous devils those Pakistanis were, instead of anyone ever asking the question of how come our friends, the Pakistanis, are backing our enemies, the Afghan Taliban, against us there. Because once you raise that question, it's pretty easy to answer. It's because we're backing their worst enemies in power in Kabul. And we're basically forcing them into this situation and in this entire counterproductive narrative. We're giving them all this aid and they're backing our enemies with it. And this and that kind of thing. So it was a half a narrative, but the important part lost at the time, unfortunately, on Afghanistan. But there's, one of the most important parts of the story of Iraq War II was really the neocons thought that by installing a supermajority Shiite government, that it would be really friendly with America and it would put all this pressure on Iran to succumb to America's will at the face of invasion, or at least under all this pressure from Iraqi Shia. to get with the program or whatever kind of thing. Well, that was nonsense. It didn't work that way at all. Of course, the Iraqi Shia groups that America fought for in that war were much closer to Iran than to us, no matter how much we bribed them. And so by 2006, the Bush regime decided that they had really screwed up and they needed to tilt back toward the Sunni axis of Saudi Arabia, Turkey and the GCC states, Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, and get back with them and allied with the Turks and the Israelis. And there's a Seymour Hersh article about this called The Redirection. And part of what he talked about in there was support for the Muslim Brotherhood groups with help from our friends, the Qataris, in Syria. And so this is in the WikiLeaks, later verified in Manning's WikiLeaks 3 years later when they came out, or 4 years later when they came out in 2006, talk of support for Muslim Brotherhood and other Sunni radical groups in Syria. The Sunni-based insurgency in Iraq War II were the Americans' enemies. Now they're turning right around and trying to create a new one in the country next door. And that began under Bush in 2006. And then that's really the policy that Obama picked up in 2011. And that Muslim Brotherhood group, we now call them Ahrar al-Sham, AKA the moderate rebels, that the CIA, who are founded by bin Ladenites, original al-Qaeda guys, and backed by the CIA from 2011 through 2017, and possibly still to this day.
That's absolutely sickening.
And so the origin of all of that is in the WikiLeaks cables as well.
Definitely. And I think that without WikiLeaks, that level of just, stomach churning hypocrisy would never have been exposed in the ways that it has been. And any other thoughts you have on that, on specifically the way in which, we have been shown to be supporting, or the United States government has been funding and helping horrific, awful groups that we then later backtrack and pretend that we're the enemies of. There have been so many examples of that. I didn't know if you have any more that you'd like to share with us.
Oh, well, let's just keep talking about the same one still.
Long list, okay, yeah.
So, and this isn't all exactly from the WikiLeaks, but the Syria War 2011 through right now, basically. As we talked about before, after the Arab Spring broke out in North Africa, America and its allies, particularly Saudi Arabia, figured out how to hijack and misdirect the Arab Spring for their own purposes. So Gaddafi was really a PR stunt to try to pretend that, see, America doesn't back the dictators. We back the little guys. We back the rebels, to just kind of muddy the water and confuse the issue after two of our dictators just got overthrown twice in a row there. And then, of course, that was the American motive. The French had their own motives for their regime change, Sarkozy and all that. But then the real worst part of it came in Syria. So if you look at Iraq War II under George W. Bush, as I said, he empowered the Iranian faction, the Iranian-backed Shiite faction, and put them really in power. And part of the reaction to that was that virtually the entire western half of the country, the predominantly Sunni parts of the country, went to insurgency, and including al-Qaeda in Iraq, what was known as al-Qaeda in Iraq, the suicide bombers, Zarqawi's guys, the very worst guys who aligned themselves with bin Laden's goals and fought the very worst part of the civil war on the Sunni side. And so this was, Bush had just really taken al-Qaeda from 400 guys and made it 40,000 or 4,000 anyway. Let's not get too carried away. And that was really bad, but that was a big screw up. That was not how it was supposed to be. That was just the results of what was. But what Obama did in Syria was outright treason. He knew from the very beginning, his government knew, it was reported open source all over the place from the very beginning, that guess who's back? Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Zarqawi's guys. The Sunni tribal leaders had virtually eliminated them from power, lucky enough for us, in what was called the Sunni Awakening in 2007 and 8. It really started before the Americans even bribed them to do it. And so al-Qaeda in Iraq had been almost eliminated, but Obama came and took them off of life support and shot them up with CIA guns and money and restored them right back to power again. They had a brand new mission to oppose Assad in Syria. And this went on for 2 years before ISIS broke off from al-Qaeda's leadership and established the beginning part of their state in eastern Syria. And then after another year in 2014, they invaded Western Iraq and conquered all of it. And they created what became called the Islamic State. And it was the size of Great Britain. And then this necessitated launching Iraq War III to clean up the mess that they had made in supporting these groups that then got way out of control and jeopardized the status of the entire project in Iraq. So then they launched Iraq War III, again taking the side of the Shiite militias to kick the Islamic State out of Fallujah, Ramadi, Mosul, etc. And so in the war in Syria and in Iraq War III in Iraq, we're talking another at least 500,000 people killed. I mean, untold, uncatalogued, unreported grief and misery and pain and dead bodies all over the place. An entire new 2 wars that Obama caused there for the al-Qaeda guys and then against the Frankenstein monster that grew up out of that support again, leading us to where we are now, where Trump supposedly wants to get out of Syria, but his guys are staying because his men want to stay because Iran is there. And Iran has come only, of course, to help Assad to put down this jihadist insurrection against him, the one that Obama only supported in the first place, to punish Assad for being allied with Iran and to try to check Iranian influence. So the whole thing has backfired. And now that it's backfired, 10 times over this way and that, now they want to stay even longer. They want to pretend history began yesterday again, and that now they have to stay because of Hezbollah and Iran and their role in Syria, which is crazy, and which hopefully Trump is going to make a deal with Putin in Helsinki that says, no, if you agree that you'll tell the Iranians to pack up and go home, then we will pack up and go home, and then let Assad finish the war and call the whole damn thing off by then. But I'll go ahead and add one more thing here, which is Sharmeen Narwani, who's a great journalist on this, writing for the American Conservative, last week, wrote about this, and then she came on my show and talked about it, how the CIA control room, as they call it, in Jordan, where they ran the southern group of al-Qaeda terrorists there in southwestern Syria, that it's still open for business and running these guys in the last part of the war there. And she said she didn't know for sure whether CIA was still there, but it was the same operational control system there, still being run at least by the Jordanians and then presumably the Saudis and then the Americans as well. So best I can tell, a year ago, Trump really did try to call off CIA support for these guys, and now it's starting to look like they never really did obey him.
Yeah, that is an incredibly important point. And actually, we have a number of questions from the YouTube chat, and our viewers have asked, and I want to get in as many as I can before we end this segment. One of them asked, do you think that was the CIA involved in corrupting the election in Ecuador by adding 2 CIA puppet candidates, just as was the case in their question says, as with the U.S. elections? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I have no
idea about that, and I'd love to know where to read about it. If those are the accusations, I'd be very interested to know, but I really don't know.
Great. Yeah. So if the person who asked that question has a link that they want to refer to, that would be really interesting for all of us to see. Another viewer asks if you think that neocons and neoliberals are in fact the same. And
yeah, pretty much. Okay. So a neocon, we use this term way too broadly as like an ideological definition, but I prefer to use it really as a biographical definition. And so what a neocon really is a neoliberal that is a kind of center-left Cold War type liberal, pro-business liberal Democrat who became a right-wing hawk because the Democrats got too infected with new left hippieism in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And so they put Israel first, and they put the Cold War against the Soviet Union first. And part of that also was because many of them were former Trotskyites. And so as Americans and Trotskyites, they had a very particular, strange, different than the rest of us, grudge against the Soviet Union, the Stalinist Soviet Union. And so
That makes sense.
if you look, basically there's Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz. They're, two very important parts of one major faction. And then you have Max Schottman and the Social Democrats USA and all those socialists that were under Max Schottman, who was also Trotskyite. And then you have really everybody that William F. Buckley hired to run the National Review in the 1950s. They were all a bunch of ex-communists. James Burnham and Whittaker Chambers and Sidney Hook and all of these guys were ex-Trots. They were ex-Trots who really hated the USSR. And since the old right basically all just got old and retired and died at that point, and there was nobody left to represent a kind of anti-war, anti-Cold War, right-wing, pro-peace kind of point of view, the National Review and their ilk ended up defining conservatism really as neoconservatism from the very beginning.
And I have a final question. Go ahead.
If anybody wants to learn about neocons, go to right-webonline.com, something like that. Anyway, just search right web. There are a couple different ones, but you'll know the one, and it has a profile, not of every right-winger in America or any, right-wing or any kind, but almost exclusively of the neoconservative set. And it's these incredible profiles of them and of all of their think tanks and all of their everything. And then if you want like one good thing, Google Jim Loeb, like earlobe, Jim Loeb, neoconservatism in a nutshell. And that's a speech that he gave on YouTube at a anti-Israel lobby conference a few years ago. That is just perfect. Jim Loeb, neoconservatism in a nutshell.
Absolutely. And thank you for pointing those sources out. I really appreciate it because I will look them up later, and I'm sure our audience will as well. There's one final question that I'd like to ask, and we do have a few minutes before we need to end this segment. And I'm happy to go like a couple of minutes over the hour. But one of our viewers asked, what do we do about, we being the public, what do we do about the USA killing machine? And I thought that was a really great, powerful question to sort of conclude this segment with.
Yeah. Well, I wish I knew. I mean, I try to expose it the best I can every day. Is kind of my thing. I think, well, I'll tell you this. I have a basic strategy. It's hardly foolproof or magical or, that great or anything. But Michael Bolden at the 10th Amendment Center calls it the Horton rule. And that's that you got to attack the right from the right. And that can be used the wrong way. I don't mean be more of a warmonger than the warmongers, but I mean attack the warmongers from the right and make them out to be the leftists, make them out to be the socialists. What's so conservative about world revolution? What's so conservative about a $21 trillion national debt and adding $1 trillion to it every day? What's so conservative about paying the Poles' entire military defense budget for them, whatever it is, bring up whatever it is and attack them, because every right winger is used to being attacked by leftists all day and vice versa, right? If you're going to attack a leftist, they're used to being attacked from the right. So go ahead and outflank them and get them. How do you, if you're really a liberal and you really or a real leftist and you really value, fairness on this, that, or the other thing, well, like say, for example, on guns, leftists and liberals typically are bad on guns. So what you do is you point out, you don't say, hey, that's my gun and you can't have it, screw you, boy, because they don't care about that, right? So what you do instead is you point out that, look, gun laws, of course, unfairly target poor and minorities. That's who gets grabbed for, not for hurting someone with a gun, but just for having a gun, or get shot by a cop just for having a gun. It's poor and black people, the kind of people that you're sticking up for. And you want to live in a world where murders stop and poor black people stop being killed in murders by guns. But outlawing guns isn't the way to achieve that. All you're going to do is you're going to put the kind of people you think you're fighting for in the line of fire, right? So you attack the left from the left. Same thing as you attack the right from the right. If a right-winger thinks anti-war means some stinky hippie who doesn't know what he's talking about, then you figure out a way to quote Pat Buchanan or you figure out a way, to attack the issue as a deficit hawk, attack the issue as one of, take on the neoconservative kind of utopian promises about remaking the Middle East into a new modern democratic future, and just what a completely ridiculous kind of college social engineering project that sounds like, the kind of thing that conservatives ought to reject, policing the whole chaotic world out there forever. On whose dime? How are we ever supposed to get rid of the IRS? And can you imagine a society where if you earn money, that's a crime, and you must confess to it, and the more you make, the more they will punish you for making it? That's what we have in America, and we always will until we end the warfare state. Imagine a society where we have this funny paper money that causes this massive boom and bust cycle that just throws everyone into economic instability and chaos every dozen years or so. You want to get rid of that? You have to get rid of the empire. You want to get rid of the national police forces? You have to get rid of the empire. You want the National Security Agency out of your email box? You have to get rid of this permanent state of emergency of constantly hurting people overseas. And if they're really right-wing in a religious way and they're honest, then appeal to Jesus and say, what do you really think about tearing human lives apart with high explosives? Just because we dress up in camouflage and we obey the orders of the likes of a Barack Obama or a Donald Trump, that absolves us from killing God's other children? You really are sure about that? You're willing to face St. Peter and go to the mat with that one, but government said it was okay? Is that really what we believe? And I don't know, outflank them. That's my answer. It doesn't, it's not magic, but it's more effective at least than coming at them from the point of view they could never identify with, and that they identify themselves in opposition to, in fact,
And I think that's a great insight, and I think it's a unique kind of set of advice that I don't think we've had on any of our streams. And I think it's a really accurate position that people are used to defending themselves from the left versus the right, and not from their own quadrant. And when you're talking about going after neocons from the right, it kind of just evokes this image of like Eisenhower warning about the military-industrial complex. I mean, these people are not like, as you said, they're not like the idea of a hippie or a bleeding heart. These are people who have really experienced, the inside of government and the dangers of the unlimited, unelected power structure militarily in the United States. But thank you so much, Scott, for joining us. If there's any thoughts that you have that we haven't covered yet that you want to speak about just before we end this segment, please do. But thank you, and it's an honor and humbling to speak with you in support of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I would just really encourage people to take the time to dig through those State Department cables. Again, like I said at the beginning, Google in quotes, cables reveal, and just start with that and see what you find. You'll get 50,000 results out there. It's just really incredible. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess my best to Assange and to WikiLeaks and to all the supporters. My thanks to all the supporters trying to keep this very real journalism alive. And my thanks to you, Elizabeth, for having me here. Appreciate it very much.
Not a problem. And I hope that we'll be able to speak to you again in the next Vigil. Thank you so much.
Sure, happy to.